Okay, so up until this point, we've been talking about property risk control for fire specifically. Now we're going to talk about the other kinds of property risks and the things that you can do besides insure to help reduce frequency and severity of those losses. So let me go ahead and make this a little bit bigger so you can see that. So theft, all right, that's a peril that we worry about. And I've mentioned it several times before, but I'll say it again. When people think about theft, like if you're a retail operation, people think about theft, they're worried about, a customer is going to steal something. That's not the risk that you have to worry about. That's a cost to doing business, and you're going to have to consider that. But the idea that high dollar amounts are going to come from that are pretty unlikely. When people are thinking about stealing stuff, it's money or high value, low weight items, jewelry. What do you have that is small and portable and easy to take? Nobody is stealing my generator outside that costs $20,000 to put in. You're going to need heavy machinery to be able to move that thing. Nobody's stealing that. They're looking for high value, low weight items or cash because it's undetectable and traceable. When you think about the severity of each individual loss, most of the time it's less than fire. Ironically, the total cost of theft is more than the total loss from fire each year, which is interesting. So your biggest source of theft isn't the idea that your customers are going to take something. And it isn't that somebody's going to break into your store after hours and take stuff. And it isn't that somebody's going to come in and hold you up. That's the difference between robbery and burglary, remember, is whether or not there's an element of threat involved. Your biggest risk is always employee theft. And not from your stuff necessarily. The biggest risk of employee theft is on the financial side. Who's in control of writing your checks? And can they misdirect those funds for their own uses? That's the big theft risk, even though we don't think about that as theft, employee theft. And so we talked about that in crime insurance. That's where you insure against that risk. But that's going to be by far your most severe risk because that's ongoing. And it's probably not something that happens once. A person does it once, they get comfortable with it, they get away with it, they do it a couple more times, it keeps happening, and then they go bigger and bigger and bigger until it's just unsustainable and they get discovered, and then that's the end of it. That's typically how that goes. So those other elements of theft are there, and we do need to protect against that. We need to think about that. We're not just going to leave, we're going to have cash in a locked place. We're going to have it in a cash register. We're not just going to fling it about the premises. We need physical protection of property to at a minimum, delay criminals. And then for super valuable things, it might be worth investing in an alarm system, especially when you think about after hours. Mentioned cameras before, the value of a camera is not preventative. It's really not going to reduce frequency or severity. It might reduce frequency if people know that you have cameras. Bank thefts, people know, yep, everything is recorded. And that probably is an element that cuts down on the number of bank thefts that we see. Also, do we have other procedures that we can build in to reduce theft? Like at Best Buy, I notice, at least my local Best Buy, I can't speak for all of them across the country, but every single person who walks out of that store, they ask you to see your receipt. And I bought I went in there one time, I was looking for something and I couldn't find it. I ended up buying a Diet Coke, and yep, on the way out, they asked me, can I see your receipt for that? So that's just a loss prevention procedure that's simple and it's easy. They're not aimed at preventing people from stealing sodas, but if you think about Best Buy, a lot of those things are fairly expensive. And so you need to drive that theft risk down. Their theft risk by customers is a lot higher than it would have been at our family's hardware store, for example. So I might have given that example before in the first unit when we were talking about loss control. But that's an example of a procedure we can use to reduce theft risk. What can you do? Well, right, the obvious things, locks and alarms and cameras. We talked about that. Lighting is a big deal, particularly if you're trying to cut down on burglary. People who do that, they want to operate unseen. So the darkness is their friend, and the brighter you can keep the area around your place of business, the more unlikely a target you make yourself. If you're worried about having cash, one thing you can do is try to encourage people to use credit cards. It's a little bit easier now than it would have been, 20 years ago. So that's something you can do. Most of the time when you're a retailer, you hate to turn down people who are trying to exchange cash for things that you have. right? You hate to say, oh, no, that's not good enough. So the better way to do that is if you can deposit frequently, because that'll reduce your maximum exposure, right? So a store like ours, yeah, that's the last thing our closing person did, was take money to the bank every day. We deposit our cash every day. The other thing we did, I can't remember if I mentioned this before or not, we left our cash register unlocked because the register was worth more than the cash that was inside it. I mean, we started every day, I think, with $100 in cash and change, and their cash register is worth more than that. So what you don't want is for somebody to break in and destroy your cash register looking for a tiny amount of cash. So we would leave the drawer open so that if anybody came in, they could look. And then the cash was just stored in a drawer that was beneath there. So that was kind of an interesting thing that I remember that we did. If you're a big retailer, a Target or a Walmart or something like that, you might need an armored car transport service to deal with your cash risk. If you're somewhere in between, well, it might make sense to have some type of safe. And you'll see this sometimes at various places of business. They'll say employees don't have access to the safe. Register only has $50 in it, that kind of thing. They're trying to let thieves know that, look, we're not a good target for this, because we've taken some steps to limit that in terms of protecting cash. So like I said before, the total loss due to theft, employee theft, is more than fire. And that's because your employees know where theft is possible. And so it's a matter of how they feel about their business. And it really is the number one predictor of theft is how they feel towards their supervisor. So not only is it just good practice for employee morale to begin with, to try to have good relationships among people, there's actually a theft risk that's prevented when people get along. And then, of course, on top of that, yeah, your supervisor, how they behave matters. Think about a restaurant, right? If the supervisor is, you're at a restaurant, a fast food type place, if the supervisor is constantly filling up sodas and eating food and not paying for it, well, when everybody else sees that, they say, well, why can't I do that too? And then they do. So that's obvious. Again, those aren't big risks. That's death by 1,000 cuts if you're a fast food restaurant, right? As every employee taking a free meal, it's not terribly huge in terms of the total value for each incident, but cumulatively, it might be a big deal. So you'll see a lot of places when they do this, most of the time they won't say, oh, a benefit is you get free food. Most of the time it'll be a discount, because at least then it's got to be rung up. And when you start to give things away for free, you communicate to the people that there is no value there. And when they think something doesn't have value, they'll take it. Why not? It has no value. It doesn't cost them anything. Why do they care? That's the attitude that you're worried about as a business owner. Much bigger risk is financial fraud. And so, yeah, you want to do what you can. We've mentioned this before, some of the steps you can take with accounting, with internal audits, in particular, internal controls, audits being one part of internal controls. As far as theft, yeah, access controls. So where can people get in? Yeah, you probably don't want to have 5 different entrances to your building, because that's 5 different places you've got to monitor if you're worried about stuff leaving without being paid for. Who's got keys? All right. Over time, employee turnover, how often are you changing locks? That's something, especially small business owners, it's an easy thing to forget. Same thing with safe combinations. You wouldn't want to, again, with employee turnover, you got to change those things. Who actually signs checks? Big deal. Most of the time, a lot of small businesses say, look, I'm not doing anything without every check that goes out of here, I need my signature on. I need to know. And then when you get bigger, at some point, you can't do that. You cannot monitor every single expense. When you get bigger, that's when it matters to figure out, okay, well, who's going to have these privileges and how are we going to be able to control them? Because that's a big deal. As far as employees stealing from you, what can you do to cut down on that? Well, before you hire them, I suppose you can do background checks. And that's a little bit helpful. More helpful, though, is separating duties. So it's about the structure of the workflow and making sure that no one person has too much control. So if you're in charge of the entire transaction, if you're person taking the cash and the person depositing the cash, that's a risk, right? Better to separate that and then have some sort of accounting that you have to do, some sort of reconciliation that you have to do between those two people. I can remember one of my first jobs. Well, not really. I guess I worked before I got to college too. But one of my first jobs in college, I worked at the front desk, and they sold small, food items and drink items, sodas and Tropicana juices. I remember, and cooking pizzas. I remember doing a lot of that. So small food items, but every single shift, every 3 hours, we had to reconcile the entire inventory and the cash drawer, and you couldn't leave until that was done. So every single time you had to do that, a lot of times you'd come up with a 50-cent difference, and yep, you had to account for it. And that was just part of the job. So there was reconciliation built in, probably an absurd amount given the amount of dollars that we're talking about, but they didn't want anybody thinking that any difference was okay. And it's about setting the attitude and the expectations, right? And as a boss, it doesn't hurt to say, look, there is no reason that these two numbers should not match up all the time 100%. It's going to be that way. And when you start to get the idea that, I was close enough, I was all right, then you're communicating a message to your employees that you might want to be a little careful about. So that's the idea of the workflow. That second employee should be checking the first employee's work. And then, whoever controls the books should also not be able to control assets. We didn't talk specifically about forced vacations, but we talked about it in the crime unit. That's something a lot of times that's where we discover employee theft, is when the person's on vacation. So we force people to take vacations every year to make sure that we have a time that we can see how the business operates without them. If it's substantially more profitable without them, that's a red flag. That's a problem, right? You might not discover that if the person who is in charge of the fraud is never taking time off. So that's another thing to consider with employee theft. Other property losses come from other perils. Like, I want to talk specifically about explosion, windstorm, flood, and earthquake real briefly, because these are so specific. Explosion here, we're talking about fire, but it happens rapidly. Daisy? Sorry. All right, so those of you who are going to be teachers and having to record stuff in the future, just remember your children have no respect for what you're trying to do. They're hungry. They're going to come in and get a snack. And if that disrupts your train of thought, well, that's too bad. So I was talking about other losses, and just real brief, because these, again, are so specific. Explosion starting there. Let me go ahead and make that big, get that back up. So rapid combustion, something happens quickly. So are you in a business that deals with flammable vapors and gases? Then that's something that you have to worry about. Grain storage, that's a surprise. People don't know this, unless you're in this business, that there's actually an explosion risk from having dust. So that's the problem with explosion, is it's going to happen. You don't really have time to contain it. It's done, and the damage is there. So how do you prevent that? It's not like fire, where the hope is, we can contain the fire. Explosion, you can't contain an explosion. It's an exaggeration to say there's limited suppression time. There isn't any suppression time. That's fairly instantaneous. So what can you do? Well, can you control the atmosphere somehow? Can you change oxygen levels in the atmosphere? In a highly controlled laboratory, you could probably do that. If you're talking about a grain operation, that's going to be extremely difficult to do. So is there something you can do with venting? Can you make it your container where the explosion is possible? Can you make it so its weakest point is at a certain area that would direct an explosion that way? And yes, these are considerations undertaken by people who manufacture the stuff that stores explosive materials. They're thinking about, all right, we want this to go off to the side. Let's make the side the weakest material. So if we do have a problem, that's where it goes, and it doesn't go in our other direction that's going to contaminate the rest of our manufacturing campus. This is something we can think about. Again, it's got to be done at the construction phase, though. It's not really something you can do midway through operations. We have special types of storage that we call igloo storage. And those are set up in a way to make the explosive force be specifically controlled if it happens, which is kind of a neat thing. Now we're worried about inspections. We're worried about maintenance. We're worried about day-to-day. What does this look like over time? Is this risk growing? Is the place clean? The more of that kind of thing we can do, the less likely explosions become. But you quickly see there's a limit to what you can do. And that's because of how quickly these losses take place. So In terms of windstorm, the most obvious thing is, hey, we can't control the energy source here. This is random. And we can, all right, I'm a nationwide company. I'm thinking about where to locate. I can't have disruptions. Maybe I'm part of an oil distributor along a pipeline, and I have a refining location that I don't want to be down for weeks. Well, all right, I might want to stay out of Tornado Alley when I'm locating where I'm at. I might want to stay out of California where we have off of fault lines. I might want to stay away from Florida and Texas on the coast where we have hurricane risk. But you can't completely avoid windstorm because there's an element of randomness that happens anyway. In the building construction, you can limit the amount of glass. That's one thing you can do. You can construct in a way to strap the roof on. And there's a lot of stuff going on, particularly in Florida with home building, where they've come up with new construction techniques to try to keep the roof on, because if you can do that, obviously you protect the inside a whole lot better. So that's the idea. So yeah, we should be thinking about this when we construct the building. If you've constructed the building already, whether you have or not, storm shutters is something to be thinking about for glass. So this is something that even homeowners have, but business owners, absolutely, they have this in wind areas where they know random objects are going to be propelled by wind at high speeds, and even small things can break windows. And now you've got a big potential cost if you've got big windows. They're expensive to replace. So storm shutters, that's something that's pretty common for people to use. Also, when you're building your building and figuring out where to put it, look at where the trees and the utility poles are. If you can stay out of their fall radius, that's worth considering. If you have freedom of where you're building. So again, yeah, these are things that are sometimes we need to be thinking about them when we're actually constructing a building. And beyond that, there's a limit to what you can do. Storm shutters is an exception. That's something you could do after the fact for windstorm. When we talk about flood, again, specific, avoidance is your best technique. Stay out of the low-lying areas. So we have flood maps for the whole country, and it does give you some insight of the probability of a certain area flooding. It's not technically correct to say there is a 1 in 100 chance that this area will flood in the 100-year floodplain. That's an approximation, but it's close enough to the idea. We want to construct in areas that have less likelihood than that of flooding. Unfortunately, we have 500-year floods that happen. We had 2 that happened back to back not that long ago in North Dakota. So you say, hey, we built above the 100-year floodplain. Yeah, if you have a 500-year flood, that doesn't matter. Then you're wanting to think about, okay, well, if we do get flooded, it's a little bit like water damage from fire. Where's that overflow water going to go? It's just that it's a bigger risk here because we're talking about the whole area. So can you build up? And if you ever have seen a beach house, this is the example. A lot of times they're constructed on stilts. And you'll see the bottom 10 feet or the bottom 20 feet are just pillars. And so that's where people will park. And then the lowest floor of the house is constructed above that. You can do that in the commercial realm too. You could construct elevated. The other thing you want to do is whatever valuable property you've got that is mobile, you want to keep it mobile so that you could move it if you had to. So it's funny how simple these things are. The problem is they tend to get overlooked, especially by small businesses. When you're running a business, you got a million things to think about. You don't have time to think about, how good of a job have we done protecting ourselves against the risk of flood? It's something that where an element of risk management makes sense is when you're starting out brand new or building a new location, something like that. That's where it's got the greatest value. Earthquake, again, very specific. Reminder, Indiana has actually a fairly high risk of earthquake. We just haven't had one in 150 years, or at least not a significant one. You might want to look into that New Madrid fault. Your perceptions of where earthquake risk are might not line up with reality. In earthquake-prone areas, we are worried about shaking back and forth. So buildings can be constructed in a way to allow for a little bit of sway without toppling the entire structure. And in fact, a lot of this is written into code in these areas. Outside of construction in a specific way, earthquake, if you have a significant one, there's a limit to what you can do. Those are fairly destructive things. and there's not a whole lot you can do. They're unpredictable and random, so it's not like you're going to have time to prepare and reduce your risk that way. Your best shot here is on the building side, and again, that assumes that you're at that phase. Okay, that's a good place to stop because we talked about property risk control. We'll do liability risk control next. Thanks a lot, you guys. If you have questions, like always, send me an email. I'll do the best I can to answer.